They bound her wrists with coarse rope and carried her through a dawn that smelled of wet straw and smoke, while the village children, asleep in their thatch, would later say they heard a woman screaming like the cracking of a tree. The crowd that gathered did not come only for justice. They had come for theater, for the exorcism of fear, for a name to pin their anxieties on. What happened next? The smoke, the confession torn from lips by the stretch of iron, the ledger entry that recorded a life as culpable, was public and private at once, an act of authority and a ritual of release. This is the world we will walk into. A world where accusation and fear braided together so tightly that mercy was hard to find, where the tools of torture sat beside the sacraments, and where the stake, the rack, and the inquisitor's ledger carried as much meaning as any sermon. If the idea of listening to such histories draws you in, like and subscribe. Stay, and we will move through these flame-lit corridors together, listening for the small human sounds beneath the clatter of judgment. The accusation and the night watch, ground-level fear, naming, and the first arrest. In the first chapter, we descend into the immediate human moment when accusation takes form. Imagine a cold moon over a village green, a woman accused after a series of misfortunes, cattle sickened, a child's fever, a failed harvest, and neighbors exchange glances that are equal parts superstition and calculation. This chapter will trace how rumor becomes indictment, the roles of local gossip, parish conflicts, and personal vendettas, the language used to describe suspects, from witch to sorcerer to suspicious presence, and the mechanisms by which a person was arrested, often by night, sometimes by force. The sensory world is close and intimate. The scrape of a chair, the smell of urine in a poorly ventilated cell, the heavy clack of wooden shutters closed over a trembling face. I will examine the social pressures that push communities towards scapegoating, famine, plague, and the strain of war, each making supernatural explanations more tempting. Where records allow, I will name specific practices, oath-bound testimonies, parish records, the involvement of local magistrates. And where evidence is fragmentary, I will present rumor or later chroniclers' accounts as such. The chapter is a study in escalation, how a whispered suspicion, fed by fear and sometimes greed, could become a legal process that stripped a person of rights and dignity before a single formal inquiry began. The chamber of questioning, interrogation, torture, and forced confession. In video, we move inside the rooms where truth was extracted by pressure. Interrogation was not a polite asking of questions, but an engineered collapse of resistance. The strappado that yanked shoulders from sockets, the rack that braided muscle and tendon into scream, the thumbscrew's deliberate grinding. This chapter will refuse euphemisms while keeping careful historical boundaries, naming instruments where chronicles and court records attest to them, and marking as rumor or later myth devices that appear only in sensational accounts. We will sit in the dimness with clerics and secular magistrates who argued over procedure. Watch as a confessor murmurs half advice and half condemnation, and listen to the terrible arithmetic of proof that depended not on evidence, but on confession coerced by pain. Sensory detail will be blunt and intimate, the metallic tang of blood, the slick sweat of a prisoner's hair, the echo of a rope's snap. We will examine the legal frameworks that permitted such methods, the inquisitorial manuals, the permissions granted by bishops or secular lords, and the moral contortions of those who believed force could reveal truth. Where historians disagree about frequency or legality, I will be explicit. Some practices were common in certain regions and periods, rare or condemned in others. The human cost is the chapter's core. Lives broken to produce documents, confessions written in trembling script, and households left to pick up the pieces after a public humiliation that had been called justice. The trial, the spectacle, and the sentence. Public rituals of punishments and the personal ruin. The third chapter places us in the courthouse and the square where verdicts were sung and punishments performed. Trials were often theatrical. Robes, sermons, and the slow reading of accusations meant to instruct as much as to adjudicate. Here we will see how penalties ranged: fines, banishment, forced penance, and for those judged most dangerous, the stake. The chapter will describe the ritual choreography of an execution, the clodhoppers of wood underfoot, the priest's rites muttered over a condemned hand, the smell of oil and straw sets aflame. Yet the focus will remain human and granular. A family stripped of income, a child marked by neighbor suspicions for life. The humiliation of being paraded and pilloried before the sentence is carried out. We will also consider regional variation, how English parish courts differed from continental inquisitorial processes, how urban centers sometimes preferred exile and corporal punishments, while borderlands kept harsher customs, and call out where later historians have conflated practices across time and place. Above all, this chapter will insist that punishment was not merely about removing alleged witches, but about signaling social order. The public stake taught the community who could be feared, controlled, and expelled. Theology, law, and the machinery of persecution, institutions, and ideology. Widening the lens, the fourth chapter explores the intellectual and institutional architectures that made witch hunts possible. Belief in maleficium, in pacts with the devil, and in diabolical conspiracies found reinforcement in theological texts, pastoral manuals, and emergent legal codes. This chapter will trace how treatises, some penned by theologians and jurists, translated anxiety into doctrine, how bishops and secular rulers sanctioned inquisitions or restrained them, and how the printing press spread both fear and critique. The sensory palette here is different. The crisp whisper of a freshly printed pamphlet, the stern cadence of a sermon that reads like a charge sheet, the cold hush of a manuscript library where manuals on demonology and procedure were consulted. We will examine the politics of persecution, how rulers sometimes weaponized witchcraft accusations to seize property, how confessional conflicts intensified searches for spiritual enemies, and how misogyny and social control intersected to mark particular kinds of bodies, older women, midwives, the poor, as prime targets. Where scholarship debates the relative weight of ideology versus social stressors, I will present the competing interpretations and make cautious inferences, always noting the limits of our sources. Memory, resistance, and reckoning, legacy, myth, and the modern gaze. The video traces how societies remembered, and in many cases forgot or reframed, the violence of witch hunts. It follows the arc from early modern fury to Enlightenment skepticism, showing how the rise of legal safeguards, critiques by enlightened jurists, and shifts in scientific understanding eventually discredited widespread persecution. Yet memory is imperfect. Folklore preserved chilling tales, literary works romanticized or demonized victims, and some communities kept silence for generations. This chapter will consider modern historical reckonings, memorials, scholarship that recovers names from parish ledgers, and debates over how to interpret the past without anachronism. The prose will be elegiac and reflective, smelling of damp archives and older wood, and will ask provocative questions about responsibility, forgiveness, and how societies today should remember those whose voices were snuffed under judgment. Where evidence is sparse or colored by later agendas, I will be transparent, framing claims as rumor, chronicler bias, or historian's inference. The closing reflection will be on power and mortality, how fear made communities turn on their own, and how the instruments of control, trial, torture, execution, reveal deep truths about vulnerability and the human cost of maintaining order. They led her to the square under a sky that smelled of rain and wood smoke, and what followed was never merely punishment, but a public pedagogy, a demonstration of fear made law, of suspicion turned ritual. We have walked through the low rooms where confessions were pried from teeth and bone, stood in the glare of court fires that reduced names to ash, and listened to the ledger entries that treated people as liabilities to be expunged. What endures is not only the horror of instruments, the rack's slow arithmetic, the stake's bright mouth, but the quieter devastations. A family ruined, a child whose life was rerouted by neighbors' whispers, a village taught to rout out its own shadow. History will argue over causes, climate and famine, misogyny and parish politics, demonology and the press of war. And where the archive is thin, we must mark rumor and chronicler bias with a steady hand. Yet the moral contour is clear. Societies that sanctify certainty too quickly will often build their certainties on human ruin. Today, there are memorials in cobbled squares and names recovered from parish rolls, attempts to reckon with what was done in the name of order. They ask us to remember not only the spectacle, but the private sorrow behind it. If this tracing of flame-lit corridors stayed with you, tell me which image clung longest to your thoughts. And if you want more histories that listen to the small, brutal sounds beneath the great ones, like, subscribe, and return. We will open another door together.